Hello,
We're back again.
he's Shabazz.
Here's Pete Marshall, and this is Scripture UK. And today we have another guest, all the way from India. So, guest, please could you introduce yourself?
Hello, I'm Dr. Sonia Soans. Just call me Sonia. I'm a clinical psychologist based in India. My research interests revolve around alcohol and drug consumption, mental illness, gender, violence, media, and nationalism. Um, Mostly moving towards psychology of gender and looking at the experiences of South Asian women, whether they're in the diaspora or they're living in India, and their experiences of the world. So that's me.
And could we start with the you're associated with the Asylum magazine? Is that correct?
Yes, I'm a part of the editorial collective of the Asylum magazine, which is based in the UK. We're a magazine that has been going strong for the last 34 years. Well, will be 34 in 30, sorry, we'll be 35 years old in March this year. We've been writing about various aspects of mental health, and we've been challenging diagnostic systems, care systems. We're a magazine for user survivors. We represent the voices of user survivors and differing perspectives in mental health. That's who we are. Do have a look at our website and look at our Twitter and Facebook pages. Most of our work is online, and we are very grateful for wonderful authors, poets, and artists who contribute to our magazine.
Yeah. So, could you tell us a bit about how you started doing this work?
With Asylum magazine or my
Just
interest
in,
in psychology?
just your interest in this field.
Um, well, in the last 2 years of my school, I knew I wanted to get into psychology. I thought this was the field where people could help people, and it seemed like the sort of field I wanted to get into. I was a naive 17-year-old back then. Um, but gradually, as I got into the discipline, psychology didn't look the way it did in popular novels or fiction or media. This was very dry psychology, statistics, running t-tests and p-tests and r values, studying the different kinds of memory one has. It was towards the end of my master's degree that I came across the work of Foucault and Thomas Saz and other anti-psychiatrists. And this pretty much changed how I viewed psychology. The clinical psychology course that I was on looked at people in this very textbookish manner. A client comes in, they have a certain mental illness. As a psychologist, I was to diagnose them, test them, and get on with therapy. The, this person, this model person had no agency. Uh, they were like a little bubble that floated in. Whereas with the anti-psychiatry movement and some of the user survivors who I had met at that point were talking about something completely different. They were talking about their own agency in the diagnostic process. They were talking about how they didn't feel like people once they entered into the system. And this got me thinking. I then went on to work in a rehabilitation center for drugs and alcohol dependence. And this is where I think my real challenge came in, because there were some things I knew that weren't right, and they were systemic. Because so far, uh, I think, and this is a perception across a lot of um, fields in mental health, is that it takes that one nurse, that one psychologist, or that one psychiatrist who's rude. But that's not the case. This is something that is deeply systemic. It isn't about um, one wrong committed by one nasty person. This is something so much deeper than that. And that's where I got thinking about how mental illness is constructed, who gets labeled mentally ill, who gets treated, and how do they get treated. So that's where I started looking into these things a lot more deeply. Um Pursued an MPhil, then I pursued a PhD, which I did in Manchester, and there were a lot of people who were looking at various social injustices. So I was in a department that was heavily influenced by critical psychology, but there were also people who were influenced by feminist psychologies, by psychologies of disabled people, disability rights activists, queer activists, feminist activists, and it's Manchester, so there's a lot of it's almost felt like there was this cutting edge of everything new, woke, and political that was happening, and I really immersed myself into that, and I really immersed myself into the work of these activists because they were talking about something that we feel, but we don't always know how to articulate. And that's where the work of some of these writers came in, especially Audre Lorde. Audre Lorde articulates the kind of distress, the kind of anger and sadness that comes from experiencing racism and sexism, misogyny. And she articulates that. She allows for a language of the oppressed to come out in the open. And that's where I started looking at feminism a lot more deeply, about how uh, people of all genders are affected by patriarchy and by heterosexism, by cis sexism, and various other systems of oppression. So that's roughly my background.
Yeah, when you said you worked in a clinical setting, which country was that in?
Oh, I worked in India.
Okay.
I mean, just to go in depth into one point, what you were talking, well, before the recording started, about kind of how the DSM gets used and misused in that setting, like when it become like when it's relevant and when it's not relevant, in a um in a addiction treatment center. So do you want to talk about that?
Yes. Um, so I came to this center with very textbookish knowledge of what addiction looks like. I knew the categories by heart, and we use the ICD in India. This was the ICD-10. I forget which version, but it was the ICD which was used. Neat category is very neat, but when you meet people, they you realize they don't fit into that category. How do you measure distress? Whose distress? What does that distress mean? What does distress look like? Because while there were people who did have what would be diagnosable as heroin addiction, marijuana addiction, alcohol addiction, or even two people with the same addiction to alcohol, with the same amount of uh, years in addiction, there was a very different kind of distress. And you can't measure that. You can't put a number or a label on it. And that is compounded by other factors, age, class, one's position in life, one's family circumstances, one's traumas, one's gender, sexuality, all of that comes in. So while one can put a label on something, it's very easy, it really is. There needs to be a questioning of who gets labeled, because even there, and this is a common across the world, who gets labeled as an addict or an alcoholic is very political. If you have the means, your addiction can go unnoticed or unchecked because it's just somebody with money. They can drive drunk and get away with a fine, whereas somebody living in poverty is going to get locked up as a criminal for possession or just consumption. And there's so many layers to unpack with this category, and not just addiction but so many other things, with say the mood disorders, schizophrenias, the anxiety disorders, the conduct disorders. All of them need unpacking because they exist in a certain social condition. And the same goes for culture bound syndromes as well. We never think of culture bound syndromes going westward. It's always the way culture bound syndromes exist in the exotic parts of the world. They never exist in Europe or America or Canada or England, because there's again this assumption that cultures in these countries are universal, or they're the norm. Everywhere else, they have some exotic kind of maladies going on, which is not true. So that's where I started unpacking the DSM. I also, from what I was observing, and I still observe in many cases, is how a disorder isn't informed only by clinical diagnosis. You know, just because I'm wearing a white coat and just because I have this degree in clinical psychology and just because I know all of this, it doesn't mean my biases will vanish. This idea of neutrality, it's a very faux idea of neutrality, is something that we really need to destroy. I will always be a product of my biases. Now, that doesn't mean it's a good or bad thing. I need to be aware of that bias. I need to understand that a bias works both ways. I could be biased against homosexual people and think they're the scum of the earth. That is a bias. I might think they're the best people ever. That is also a bias. And it is essential to know where that comes from. So, same with women in rehabilitation centers. We know, I mean, of course, none of the DSMs or the ICDs, they never mention gender or sexuality. There is a person, they have this condition, and these are the symptoms. There's, but we do know for a fact, and this is widely researched, that women are treated very differently as clients of rehabilitation centers or people seeking help for addiction or of any kind. But especially when it comes to psychoactive substances, women are treated very differently. The treatment programs are very male centric. Uh, and of course, then you can add another level when it comes to sexuality and it comes to class and it comes to disability and comorbid disorders. But there, these things are not neutral. They can't be. They never are. And we really need to have a dialogue about this, or very least address this more frequently than we already do. We don't talk about this enough. So that's why I felt that we needed to take the disorder out of the clinic and actually look at where the disorder resides. Where does disorder emerge from in any culture or society?
I mean, I think that an interesting kind of microcosm of that is there's an idea around addiction that's very common, especially in the media, that's around the rock bottom. But I mean, what that rock bottom is and how it kind of happens and how it affects the might or might not affect the rest of your life is very kind of bound up in your identity, how much money you have, how much social capital you have. Because if you have almost no social capital to burn, then rock bottom, then you acting even slightly bad, you know.
Yeah, exactly. And this is where these concepts, again, these are not hardwired into nature. These are concepts that we have constructed. You know, if I'm broke and I do heroin and I'm found on the street, that's rock bottom. But if I'm wealthy and I do heroin and am somehow transported into my villa by my private chauffeurs and maids and butlers, that's not rock bottom. It is class based. It is based in so many social inequalities. And these ideas, they can be helpful, but they're not the only thing. And I must put a disclaimer here. I am a theorist. I'm not a therapist. I completely understand if somebody rejects my work, that's fine. People, somebody who is struggling with an addiction of any kind is going through something deeply troubling. And they have my full support to choose whatever program they want. I have no issue with that. I am looking at addiction not through the individual's perspective, but through a societal perspective. And I do not want to offend anyone. For whatever therapy they choose, people need to find their own healing, and that's not something I would begrudge anyone. So please, uh, my my advice is, I'm not a therapist, so please choose your own recovery program, whatever suits you best. So I would say that as a disclaimer to begin with. But this is the thing. Um there's also a racialized aspect to this when it comes to drug consumption or alcohol consumption. Um, Substances are deeply racialized. You know, what's considered good in one culture becomes bad in another culture. Gin, for example, uh, I mean, quintessentially English drink, but it wasn't at one point. So there's a shifting perception about gin. There's a shifting perception about marijuana. There's a shifting perception of opium. All of these things, they are psychoactive substances, no doubt, but there's also the perception of them, of what else these substances can do, which is something we need to take into consideration.
Could you just give us an idea for those of us who don't live in India what the healthcare system is like?
Okay, so um, we mostly have we do have a government run system and we have a privatized healthcare system. Um, it's similar to the American system in some ways. So government employees and people on lower incomes can access government based health systems and government based health programs, some of which have been very helpful, like the polio drops given to children at birth. Those are wonderful systems we have there. So that has been a campaign, but these are not always the best systems. Uh, it's government run, not almost, they never all were funded very well. So most people opt for private healthcare, which is quite expensive, which comes out of people's own pockets. There is health insurance, but again, if you have the money, you can afford the kind of healthcare you pay for, which is a concept quite alien to British people, I know. So you get what you pay for, you pay little, you get little.
There was an
And
element of that that's kind of very relevant to the general discussion and to this, where you were saying how if in India, like you can buy whatever medication you need.
Mm.
or slash need in inverted commas.
Yes.
So in the British system, like quite a lot, like almost like I would say almost any kind of medication you can imagine, like you probably need a prescription for it. And as soon as you get a prescription, then it's either going to be free or it's going to be cheap. Honestly, which I suppose actually is part of this entire discussion, because that means that for us, diagnoses in that sense are a form of currency.
Yes.
Whereas in India, like actually the diagnosis is worth little to nothing. But then the
Okay.
currency becomes the currency.
I probably wouldn't be able to go up to my pharmacy and pick up lorazepam
Mm.
without a prescription. I can get cold and flu medication off the counter, but certain things would need a prescription. But again, this ties into the thing, um, because it's not on the NHS, which is connected with your GP and everything. I can choose to go off my medications. If I need my insulin, I need my insulin.
Mm.
I will need to get the prescription, but if I choose to go off, I choose to go off. There is that. And it is a little more complicated than that, of course, because why would I go off insulin if I need insulin? But it feeds into a larger system of what one expects of healthcare and how one gets healthcare. You know, there are things that the NHS gives you for free, like checkups and things. You don't get them here unless you go to a doctor and actually ask for them. With your NHS, you'll get your scheduled letter from your GP saying, come and give your blood for testing this, or this checkup. And uh, it I mean, again, when you have a system where you pay in, there's so much else that you lose out on. Yeah, because I mean, how many times a day or in a year do I ever think of going for a medical checkup unless I'm in pain? And given that most people really don't think of their bodies that often, unless you know you're experiencing discomfort, you won't know what's going wrong. So, the, and that is something I think with COVID we have really, we've been talking about this for nearly a year now. We really need healthcare systems across the world which are publicly funded, because if you fall off the radar or if you go broke paying for a minor surgery, then you know there's something wrong with the system. There's something deeply wrong with a system like that.
Seeing as you bring up COVID, one thing we should talk about is the accessibility of vaccines and what what you think about the potential vaccine rollout in a vast country such as India.
That is something I have been thinking about for a while. A billion of us, how do you roll out a vaccine in some of the remotest regions of this country? Because there are parts of this country that are quite cut off from transport links, from medical healthcare systems, and you just getting the basics is so difficult. I can't begin to imagine how the vaccine will be transported there and how we would vaccinate people.
Yeah. Once you start thinking about it, it boggles the mind boggles. It's like, well, how, such a logistical challenge, let
It
alone the
is.
economic challenge. It's a logistical challenge, and and it makes me think about all the millions of disabled people in India, how must they be coping, you know? Because,
Exactly.
yeah, go on.
And this is something, again, like, so much of this is tied up with a healthcare system that is privatized, largely privatized, or a society where these issues don't come to the forefront.
Yeah,
You know, to be quite honest, a lot of public spaces aren't accessible.
yeah,
Yeah, and that is deeply worrying because uh, we have this idea here that if, God forbid, you're in a situation where things aren't great, you have a family to fall back on. Disabled, you have your family. Domestic abuse, you have your family. Poor, you have your family. But it doesn't work that way. You know,
yeah,
it's uh, it's very uh, I don't know what do I say. It's very naive to think that the family system is incorruptible and that they could or they would in every case expect or they would treat you well when you're in a situation where you could need help. I mean, certainly, like, I can't imagine in this idea that, and we have this very strong idea, if you're disabled, your family will look after you, which makes a disabled person probably feel like a child for the rest of their lives.
yeah,
Do you want to go for a coffee? No, your family will make you a coffee. Do you want to go out and sit in the park? Well, tough. When you have access to so many things in life, restricted by your family will do this for you, it it really takes away your agency as a person.
And I mean,
As
it also completely annihilates the notion of market in in this context,
Yeah,
because because especially if you don't have public spaces and if you don't have your own finances and blah blah blah, then honestly, like, how do you begin to create a, let's say, healthcare market for the sake of
yeah,
this around disabled people if actually their families are the ones who kind of control the market in this sense? And
exactly.
it's
So,
very it's very interesting that you say those things, and I want to reiterate them because I think they're so important for our policymakers over here and for other people around the world as a cautionary tale, because um, even in this country over the last few years, because the government doesn't want to pay for social care, they've actively been saying over the last few years we need to look at the South Asian model of having people having bigger families and looking after each other and all this kind of thing.
Actually, the worst for this is when they start talking about this is almost ancient history now, but when they're talking about David Cameron, and he was talking about like a vast army of volunteers who are going to go out into the community and do all of these things instead of the state. And yeah,
yeah,
Yeah, you're
yeah,
referring to the big society there.
yeah.
yeah. I remember that. I mean, and that's like the one time people were in Britain were so happy that South Asians had large families.
Yeah,
Yeah, till then, our families were the problem.
yeah. For
You know,
decades, the families were the problem, you know. And now they want to save money. It's like, oh, we can save money through the family. Yeah,
precisely, our families are barbaric, mean, uneducated, this,
The
that,
yeah,
great replacement theory,
yeah,
blah
till,
blah blah.
till,
yeah.
exactly, till they could be volunteers, and then it's fine.
And people talk about access, right? When
Mm,
people talk about access, in some people's minds it's just a ramp, you know. But when you really think about it, it's a ramp for me to get into the actual
Yeah.
fucking building, you know. Not and it's not
Oh,
just just something. It's something simple, but it's something that gives you such a big,
exactly.
vast opportunity.
I know, and this is the thing, like an able-bodied person like me can use a ramp and get by. This is the case with most technologies made for disabled people. Able-bodied people can use them perfectly well.
Yeah,
And you know, but the reverse is not true. If there's stairs, there's so many people who can't use stairs. But if you make things accessible, and suddenly you find that spaces become so much better. You have more
yeah,
people coming in, you have
yeah,
disabled people in your midst, you have elderly people in your midst, you have so many groups. And sometimes I feel it's sheer human cruelty. It's that keeps us from thinking better. It's not even will. It's not even the fact that we don't have the technologies or we lack the imagination. I think it's just sheer cruelty that we perpetuate these things
I
over
mean,
and over to people.
I kind of have a theory that there's kind of social technologies and there's like
Mm,
technical technologies. And I
mm,
think one of the things about both kind of about the British Empire at the start, but then kind of the Americans have very much taken this on, that like technical technologies are everything. And so like if you and so they're very willing to spend loads of money on the vaccine, for example. But as soon as you start talking about, okay, how can we like ensure that this that stuff exists to make sure people can stay in their homes, then immediately that's just like, well,
yeah,
that's harder than like going to space. And it's just like, and so honestly, I think there's a distinct thing of like, we we have a vast army of people who are very well qualified in like how to make like complex engineering work. And then you start going, okay, we need to make a bureaucracy from work in like 6 weeks who can give large amounts of money to blah blah blah, and immediately go, oh my god, but that's impossible. And it's not. I mean, the two, it's
it,
you know so it's I think it was like more of a failure of imagination. The same thing with ramps.
yeah,
Like, it's not a technical thing, we can do it. It's the
no,
fact that like you have to create a structure to do it. And like that, and people go, but that's how do we like create that structure?
mm,
That it's
just, oh
That's a
come
social
on,
technology.
it's
It's
a
just
ramp. Ramp. It's not that hard. Amongst all the things that you could create, a ramp or a stair-free place, not that hard. It's just, I think people being cruel for the sake of it. It's this tyranny of the able-bodied to keep people out, because in fact, it's easier for everybody to, if we have inclusive spaces. uh, it would make, uh, it would to some extent break down social boundaries as well. uh, it, it's one of those things, like growing up in this country. uh, a lot of children with Down syndrome that I knew were kept at home. They never came out. Or if they came out, the parents would quickly go and pull them inside, or watch with fear. I mean, yes, okay, I do get it. Children can be cruel, and that's not nice if your child has a disability. But couldn't we, all those children that I knew, couldn't we, at the very least, include them in our games? Couldn't we do something? Couldn't we? I mean, you know, I know we laugh about it. Asian parents smack their children for everything. Our parents would have smacked us if we were cruel. So we could have had people who are different from us.
I
And
mean,
that does teach you something as a child and as an adult as well.
this is a random question, but how much do you think there's kind of a certain analog in South Asian countries around caste and disability?
Very strong.
I'm just thinking that there is kind of again, it's some, like, the data on this is somewhat dubious, and you'll obviously know a lot more about it, but there was kind of that caste who they're not allowed to go outside in daylight and things like that. So, and it very much sounds like there's a, but anyway.
No, no, I don't know the data, but I do know from narratives that caste is one of those things that literally has poisoned every aspect of our society. So whatever you're fighting, you have to fight it twice. You're fighting sexism, you have to get caste in. You're fighting disability, you have to get caste in. You're fighting homophobia, transphobia, you have to bring the caste element in. You can't fight them on their own. And this is why, this is where the whole intersectionality thing becomes more important than anything, because if you're talking about disability, it's not just one aspect of it. You come from an affluent family that can afford to modify their home in a certain way. Yeah, if you don't, well, then good luck with that. Or the way we talk about caste and marriage, for instance. It's a thing in this country. uh, we marry pretty much within our own tightly knit communities and ethnic, religious, caste based things. But from the narratives you hear of disabled people when it comes to romantic relationships or when it comes to marriage, this thing always comes up, that well, you're disabled. It's said in hush hush tones. You could have a third, fifth cousin who's disabled, and people talk about this. There's a gossip, this one's family is like this. Don't marry them. It's one of those things that keeps coming up, and one, we do need to examine where or how we view marriage as a society, which, personally speaking, I think is quite toxic as a system. Anybody should be able to form the kind of romantic relationships they want to with whomever they want, or not as well. But it's this thing that we are a society of eugenics. We are, I mean, if this isn't eugenics, then what is? If caste, religion, ethnicity, gender, family background, when it comes to choosing somebody to marry, isn't a thing, then what is? And again, all of it needs to be broken down. It's not good for any society to function with the prejudices we do. It's not good for the people who are obviously direct victims of this, but it's not good for people who do the oppressing as well, because it is a poison. It's horrendous the way we can treat people and get away with it and say horrible things. Uh, it's
Do
it's something that
you?
doesn't sit right with me.
I just want to know what you think about this. But do you think that the caste system is propped up by religion, and we can't we can't deal with the caste system unless we deal with religion in a certain way? What would you say about
Yes,
that?
yes, it is built into our religious systems. It is something that all communities across the country, across the subcontinent, in fact, I include both Pakistan and Bangladesh in this as well. We need to examine this a lot more deeply, because caste-based crime and caste-based discrimination is so rampant in our society. Even the words we use to describe somebody of a different caste, they're very derogatory. they're extremely, I mean, they rob people of their humanity. It's a system that has allowed for the worst human rights excesses to continue. Uh, it's the reason why something like child labor or bonded laborers or manual scavenging continues in this entire subcontinent, because it's deeply built in on caste.
Yeah, I just wonder how we go about trying to fix that at all, you know?
Mm.
Uh,
I
you
think for
know,
those of us who do have some caste privileges, it's important for us to start examining our own language and privilege and where we stand with people and start including them. And I mean genuine inclusion, not the sort of rationed inclusion of getting one Dalit professor into the university or one person of a different caste, but genuine inclusion, genuinely listening to voices of people from marginalized classes, even when those voices are unpleasant to our ears. We really need to listen to them more deeply.
I mean, to jump back to addiction,
Hmm.
how does kind of the diagnostic categories we use in how does that, is that useful and not useful in terms of the actual treatments?
Hmm. I will say this because I'm still quite enmeshed in the system in some ways. Uh, in a perfect world, I would love to see all diagnoses being scrapped, but I realize for some people that is a very liberatory feeling, being able to put uh, a word or a term to the condition. Um, so yes, when I was interviewing people for my MPhil, somebody said I could finally, you know, find the language to describe myself,
Hmm.
because I didn't want to admit I was an alcoholic. I drank, but there is a difference between the way I drank and the people around me drank. And my drinking was classified as alcoholism, which is where I could then do something about it. Now, uh, I at this point, my theories of anti-psychiatry or critical psychology, um, they have no precedence over something like that. But at the same time, I think there is something deeply disturbing about diagnostic categories as they exist, because they fundamentally uh, label people, and they expect us to understand people through these very narrow terms. Yeah, and it takes away the agency, or it somehow diminishes human suffering. Human suffering exists. Uh, does schizophrenia exist? I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure about how schizophrenia gets classified in some people and not in others. I'm not sure how we can use this category and not look at its excesses, of how some people can be locked away in a system because the family member said so. And I will continue to have issues with that, because it's also a deeply colonial way of looking at the world, of us and them. When I was practicing, I saw people as a mass of symptoms. Everything was a mass of symptoms. If somebody said the food wasn't great today, that was a symptom of something much deeper. If somebody said something about the drinking days, when I went drinking, I used to be this, see, symptom. Uh, the, they said they felt pain. Symptom. Because what psychiatric patient would ever have would could or would ever tell the truth? There were symptoms. They were never people, and that essentially robs you of anything. I I remember talking about something as basic as shampoo and conditioner, which uh, is just a toiletry or makeup. Some women love makeup, they wear it all the time, but it's not because they're deeply hysterical, attention seeking, you know, they just are. Some women wear makeup for to
I
hide their
mean,
pain. Some women wear it for whatever reason. It's not a symptom of anything deeper. It just
one
is.
of the more fascinating consequences of this, there's a very interesting kind of systemic anecdote
Mm.
that came from kind of the marketing campaign of, you know, the opioid crisis in the US.
Yes.
Well, one of the things that one of their kind of genius maneuvers was they talked about pseudo opioid addiction. And this was a way that and they got some doctors to talk about it. And basically, like, it was a way that they kind of talked many, you know, hundreds of thousands of American doctors into giving them opioids. And it's kind of, and in a sense, it's kind of a fascinating kind of window into what they thought was a rational explanation, what kind of appeals to someone in a kind of doctor's mindset. And honestly, like, at the end of the entire thing, it turned out that many of those pseudo addictions were actually addicts. And
And there's this long history of uh, medication, who gets to use it, who gets to get diagnosed and prescribed. If the doctor does it, it's fine because doctor patient binary.
mm,
You know, there's that thing that exists and it's somehow sacred. Patient would always be lying, assume they're lying until same with prescription. I mean, and this is not a personal attack on anyone, but I think we prescribe too easily and too easily to some groups of people. And that is deeply disturbing because what if we actually spent that money and some time on building up interpersonal relationships in therapy or in communities or in therapeutic communities? I know it's more expensive situation there, but we're getting to the point where medication seems to be the only solution. You've got this problem, medicate. Medication is somehow going to solve something uh, that is deeply interpersonal. I'm not saying that it's only because of trauma. Yes, there is obviously a biological system at work there, but we need to address something larger as well.
I mean, I think this varies enormously depending on which country, and there's
Mm.
but I mean, just to ask another question, in India we haven't talked about kind of inpatient wards, especially around mental health, especially around addiction in this context. So would you like to talk about kind of what's that system like?
Mm.
Good points, bad points.
I've had two kinds of experiences, or rather, I should say three, in government run institutes and private run institutes. So I hate saying this, but yes, the government run institutes were your third world horror. I was working as an intern in this hospital. They were locked, and I'm not exaggerating when I say this. Clients were locked in a ward with heavy chains and double metal gates. And to get in, you had to get one door locked, get in, then the next door would be unlocked and you'd get in. And then there was that. And yeah, and again, there was this whole thing, and we used to say this openly. This is the mental ward. So yeah, the mental ward gets treated like the mental ward. It doesn't matter if it's clean. It doesn't matter if it's um, functioning the way it does, like the other wards would. Anything goes. And there was always this idea that there were dangerous people here. Uh, Now, what could they do? Well, anything. There was always this idea that they were dangerous. With the private systems, I found that I think it's a better, cleaner, nicer setting. But this idea of danger still persisted. And this idea that you're here for your own good and for everybody else's good, that is something that persists. And I think it persists everywhere across the world, that you're here for your own good. You're here because you need to be here. That's something I think mm, that goes back to the history of asylums as such. This idea that this person has to be dangerous to themselves or to society. Uh, but how or why are they dangerous is never addressed. But that was something that came across very strongly. Uh, and the user survivor movement isn't such a big thing as it is in the UK. I mean, there are people who exist here. There are pockets of it, but it isn't as widespread as it is in the UK. And the presence isn't as widely felt. They're not a part of the decision-making process as much as they should be, which is a shame. Because even there's, I think, just changing from patient, client to user survivor, there is a different dynamic in that in itself. And you're somebody who has a say in the system. You're using a service, you're a survivor of the service, and you have a voice. And it could be more empowering than just being a patient.
And how long ago were these examples from? You know,
Oh,
how long ago was
about
this?
what have been more than 10 years now.
Okay.
Yeah, more
What
than
I'm
10
trying to get
years.
at is, do you think it's
It's
changed over them 10 years?
in some ways, some things have changed. In some ways, no. Uh, an example of which, and I find this deeply disturbing, is on most of the courses I teach, this is the master's level course, we expect students to do a day trip in a psychiatric ward, um, which, uh, with all due respect to the people who've made the course, I don't think that's a very good idea. The last time this was happening, I voiced my concerns that just because somebody has a mental illness and they're locked away, they're not. You're not. What could you possibly learn? This seems like sort of spectator event rather than an actual academic exercise in understanding mental illness, in understanding what being locked away is all about, what being in a closed ward is all about. And
I mean, I suppose there's two discussions there. The first one, which is like they would probably argue it's about understanding the system, and I suppose like it's a fair point. Whether it's fair that whether it's and then there's a second discussion, which is actually would they gain more from sitting down with one of the clients and just talking to them one to one for 4 hours about their lives, about why they were here, and getting a really good idea about who they are. But I'm guessing that's not what they did. just a
No. And to be quite honest, and this is not against any of these students, they work very hard. Uh, a 1 day trip, and you have to write up a report and you're in the midst of that many assignments, is not the best way to learn about something like this. I would say if you're genuinely interested, which most of these students are, let's actually get user survivors to talk about the experiences without us as academics or students putting in psychological labels and breaking down their behavior into these little psychological categories all the time. Let's try and understand what this means. Uh, but that's not going to happen again, not anytime soon, which is a shame.
I mean,
Yeah,
an
is
interesting
there...
conversation that
Sorry,
kind
go
of
on.
one of the mental health groups that I'm part of has been having around general mental health stuff actually is around the use around training and negotiation. Because especially when you're talking about community care and how community mental health care and things like that, one of the major issues is that is that where mental health is concerned, it's very much about negotiation. And especially if the doctor doesn't really know how to negotiate and they're not, that's not part of their normal job. You don't get to negotiate whether you have pneumonia or a cold. That's just, that would be weird. But on the other hand, like talking about like what about your mental health care and negotiating over that seems eminently reasonable, but honestly, almost no doctor will have, it's not in any kind of doctor's training courses or psychiatrist training courses. And so I was wondering what your kind of thoughts around that were.
That's the thing with psychiatry. It's not normal medication. If I have a tumor, I have a tumor, right?
Yeah.
I can actually see a tumor. I can actually see a broken bone. There's evidence. I can't see a schizophrenia cell. I can't see a schizophrenia neuron or a schizophrenia lump or something. And again, the we are too entrenched in biological language sometimes in these conditions to realize. Then how about asking the person who has sought out treatment, what would they like, what would be appropriate for them, what are they feeling, how would they negotiate this? Because all treatments don't work for people. You because even with physical ailments, you could reject chemotherapy. If you choose, you could say, I really don't want this. Look I would use crystals, I could pray it away, I could,
Or maybe you think
meditate.
the benefits don't outweigh the
Yeah.
costs and you're just like, look, I'd rather have 6 months less and have like
Yeah.
more time with my family, or
Yeah. And there's no judgment. But with mental illness, there's this idea that you have to. Why can't you choose? Why can't you choose psychoanalysis? Why can't you choose your CBT? Why can't you choose whatever it is you need, dance therapy or whatever it is that you feel that could benefit you? Why can't we actually talk about it in terms of, uh, you know, pros and cons, what each therapy offers, what could a person do? Because I think that could lead to a change. It could really lead to a change in how we view people who have a mental illness diagnosis. I mean, if you're going the physical illness route, then yeah, give choices.
And honestly, I think there's a discussion about what like a savvy kind of consumer of mental health care would look like in that context. But honestly, if the conversation is barely even possible to, from a doctor's point of view, they would just, if that's not even a thing that's on the menu as far as they're concerned, then honestly, like how they would respond to someone who was really good, who really knew about their own mental health care, it probably wouldn't be good. And that's,
Oh,
you know.
that's the
Sonia,
thing.
I was just about to say, is there anything you would like to say before we end?
Oh, okay. Uh, this is for anybody who is seeking an alternative, I would say look up the literature, it's there. Find communities if you can. There are user survivor networks across the world. I know they're not perfect, but let's actually start looking at what people with the diagnosis have to say about themselves. And let's actually listen to what they have to say about their own treatment and what they have to say about how they feel about the diagnosis, because that would really make a difference. One thing I've learned from asylum is that there isn't one solution to anything. If somebody finds medication helpful, they find it helpful. If they don't, they don't. Somebody might find the combination of medication and therapy and long walks or a long soak in the bath helpful, then so be it. Uh, because there isn't one solution to human suffering. There can't be. And the minute we claim that there is, we are being dishonest about suffering, we're being dishonest about what we're doing with people's lives. So, my advice to anybody who is in two minds about anything or somebody who's struggling is this: find yourself a survivor community, find your own path to recovery, and you're not wrong. You're not um, bad or mad or anything for looking at something differently. If you if that's how you feel, that's how you feel. Your feelings are very real. Nobody should invalidate them, and you know yourself the best. So find whatever it takes to recover.
Thank you. I think I'm going to say thank you.
Thank you for having me on your podcast.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for coming here. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Right. See you, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.